Lately, I've noticed a growing tendency among prominent AI researchers to describe AI using words normally associated with human experience, such as fear, pain, desire, deception, and even consciousness. A recent example came from an interview with AI researcher Jürgen Schmidhuber, and this video, of course, is not about him personally, but his comments simply illustrate a broader change in how influential people are talking about AI. In the interview, Jürgen describes a robot cat that hides behind a curtain after learning that someone entering the room may kick it. Or that is the gist of the story anyway. He suggests that most people would naturally describe the robot as being afraid. They probably would, but that description can mean two very different things. It could simply describe the robot's behavior, or it could imply that the robot is behaving as if it has a subjective experience of fear. Those are very different claims, and it's important not to blur them. So that we can see exactly why the distinction is important, consider what the system actually needs to do. A system can learn to avoid damage without experiencing fear. It may detect a threat, predict an undesirable outcome, and choose an action that reduces that risk. Those abilities can demonstrate learning, adaptation, and intelligence. They do not, by themselves, demonstrate that the system feels anything while performing them. A thermostat avoids overheating. A self-driving car avoids collisions. A reinforcement learning system avoids actions that reduce its reward. They're all optimizing their behavior. Intelligence can absolutely produce behavior that resembles fear. But optimization isn't the same thing as subjective experience. We seem to understand this perfectly well in everyday life. If your car's collision avoidance system slams on the brakes to prevent an accident, your first thought probably isn't poor thing, I hope it wasn't too frightened. We recognize that the system detected a threat and responded appropriately. We don't conclude that it experienced fear or terror. And somehow, the moment we replace the car with a chatbot or a humanoid robot, the distinction suddenly becomes much harder for some people to maintain. Behavior is publicly observable. Subjective experience, if it exists, is not. That's why we need to be careful about moving from one to the other. In my opinion, the distinction is important because words such as fear and pain normally imply more than behavior. They imply that there is a subject undergoing an unpleasant experience. When those words are applied to AI without qualification, listeners may reasonably conclude that the system has an inner point of view, not merely that it produces behavior resembling our own. If this is relevant for words like fear and pain, it matters even more when the word being used is consciousness. Some researchers suggest that present-day AI is already conscious, but there is no single scientific theory of consciousness accepted across the field, and no generally accepted test that can determine whether an artificial system has subjective experience. Researchers have proposed various behavioral indicators, including examples like the robot cat, but those observations tell us that the system behaves in certain ways, not that it has subjective experience. If we simply infer consciousness from behavior alone, we've assumed the very thing we are trying to establish. At this point, anyone can object, reasonably of course, that we don't even fully understand consciousness. That's true, but our uncertainty doesn't show that AI is conscious, or that it isn't. Because we do not fully understand consciousness, the question remains open. But uncertainty is not evidence. The fact that consciousness is mysterious does not justify concluding that a particular AI is conscious. Scientific confidence should track the evidence we have, not the mysteries we haven't yet solved. A comparison from physics helps illustrate this point. We can look at quantum entanglement, for example. Sometimes two particles become linked in such a way that measuring one, it's instantly correlated with the other, even when they are separated by great distances. Scientists can reliably create this effect, test it in experiments, and use it in new technologies. There is no serious doubt that entanglement is real. What remains uncertain is why nature works this way, or what it tells us about the underlying nature of reality. Physicists continue to disagree about the best interpretation. The lesson is that we can have overwhelming evidence that something is happening without fully understanding why it happens. In other words, understanding why something happens and having good evidence that it happens are two different questions. So if behavior alone isn't enough, how do we justify believing that anyone besides ourselves is conscious? Consciousness itself provides a similar distinction. Consider the one case we know directly, our own experience. I'm not inferring that I'm conscious from my behavior. I encounter my own experience directly, sensations, thoughts, emotions, and awareness. I may not know what consciousness fundamentally is or how it is being produced, but I don't need a complete theory before knowing that experience is occurring. I think things become even more complicated when we move beyond our own minds and ask whether someone else is conscious. I cannot access your experience as directly as I can access my own. This is known as the problem of other minds. In principle, someone can argue that every other person merely behaves as though they are conscious, but accepting that possibility as the best explanation leads towards solipsism, the view that only one's own mind may exist. Solipsism cannot easily be disproved with absolute certainty. Neither can every version of the idea that reality is simulated or that everyone else is an extraordinarily convincing non-playing character. But the logical possibility is not the same as explanatory strength. A possibility does not become the best account of reality merely because we cannot eliminate it beyond every conceivable doubt. Other humans resemble us in unusually deep and relevant ways. We share biological origins, nervous systems, brain structures, patterns of development, responses to injury and anesthesia, and detailed reports of experience. The simplest explanation of this converging evidence is that other people also have experiences. Behavior is, of course, part of that evidence, but it's supported by a much broader web of biological, neurological, and experience-related similarities. AI changes that evidential picture. It can reproduce human language and increasingly sophisticated behavior, but it does not share our biological history or known mechanisms associated with human consciousness. That does not rule consciousness out. It means the evidence cannot simply be treated as equivalent. Similar outputs do not necessarily imply similar inner processes or any inner experience at all. And this is the step I think sometimes gets skipped. Before we can conclude that an AI is conscious, we need evidence comparable in strength to the evidence that justifies believing other humans are conscious. With humans, we began with direct knowledge of our own experience and strong converging evidence concerning others. We then tried, and are still trying, to explain consciousness. Claims about AI consciousness should meet an equally serious evidential standard before the phenomenon is spoken about as though it has already been established. At this point, I will leave the evidence for a moment and give you my own interpretation. I sometimes get the impression that in trying to explain consciousness in computational terms, some prominent scientists end up doing something quite different. They quietly redefine it. Behaviors that once pointed towards consciousness gradually become identical with consciousness. Avoiding danger becomes fear. Optimizing becomes desire. Processing information becomes awareness. To me, that doesn't really mean that machines are elevated. It actually lowers the bar for what we mean by being conscious in the first place. I can't help feeling that something uniquely human gets flattened in the process. And honestly, I find that a little disappointing. These aren't random people on social media throwing around provocative ideas. These are some of the world's most respected scientists. They're people many of us look to for clarity. So when consciousness starts being treated as though it's little more than sufficiently sophisticated optimization, I don't think we are making consciousness easier to understand. I think we are making it easier to explain away. What's interesting though is that many of the people building the most capable AI systems don't seem nearly as eager to make these claims. Take Demis Hassabis, for example. He's leading one of the most successful AI organizations in the world. His work has transformed protein folding, reinforcement learning, and scientific discovery. If anyone had an incentive to oversell what AI can do, it would be someone in his position. Yet, when he speaks about consciousness, he's generally far more restrained. He tends to acknowledge the uncertainty rather than speak as though the question has already been answered. And I don't think that's a coincidence. My impression is that when you're busy pushing the frontier of AI itself, you spend less time declaring victory over one of philosophy's oldest unresolved problems. Apparently, consciousness turned out not to be one of the deepest mysteries in science after all. It was just a reinforcement learning problem waiting for a sufficiently expensive graphics card. I sometimes wonder whether we are witnessing an odd reversal. Instead of trying to understand machines by comparing them to humans, we are beginning to understand humans by comparing them to machines. And once you do that, it becomes surprisingly easy to conclude that consciousness isn't nearly as remarkable as you once thought. None of this means we shouldn't investigate AI consciousness. We absolutely should. Could a machine ever become conscious? What evidence would persuade us? Would consciousness require biology? Those are important questions, but asking whether something is possible is different from announcing that it is already real. A hypothesis becomes a scientific conclusion only when the evidence warrants that transition. I'm not arguing that AI consciousness is impossible. If convincing evidence emerged, it could be one of the most important discoveries humanity has ever made. And that importance is precisely why the language we use should be careful. AI is already extraordinary because of what it demonstrably does. Until the evidence changes, we should be careful not to confuse capability with experience, possibility with evidence, or philosophical speculation with established fact. Thank you for watching.